Did you know that 1 in 10 men suffer from depression? But fear, shame, and the lack of understanding about depression prevents them from seeking help. And then tragically, 35,000 men are successful with suicide then because of depression. So Mark Meier is my guest tonight. He is CEO and founder of the FaceItFoundation.org. And we're talking because it's what we can do together to help men face down their depression. And thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here, and this is such an important topic. And you nailed it at the beginning. Fear, shame, and stigma is what prevents so many men from coming forward. And when they don't come forward, sadly, and even now I realize I have to update my website, Diana, because sadly we've now gone to 39,000 men die by suicide each year in this country.
Well, that's a sad number. But here's how our conversation got started is I saw something online written by actor Will Wheaton. I had no idea what his backstory was. But he prepared this for a NAMI conference. He says, I'm 45 years old, I have a wife, 2 adult children who make me proud every day, and a daughter-in-law who I love like she's my own child. I work on the most popular comedy series in the world, Big Bang Theory, right? I've been a New York Times #1 best-selling audiobook narrator. I've run out of space in my office for the awards I've received for my work. And as a white, heterosexual, cisgender man in America, I live life on the lowest difficulty setting with a celebrity cheat enabled. That's it. Good for him. And that's pretty funny. But he says, my life, by every objective measurement, very, very good. And in spite of that, I struggle every day with my self-esteem, my self-worth, and my value, not only as an actor and writer, but as a human being. That's because I live with depression and anxiety.
And it's such a powerful statement that speaks to the real impact of life with depression. Here's a guy who openly acknowledges, I've got everything. I mean, are you kidding? He's got the perfect life, and yet he still struggles. And I think what that speaks to is the power, the devastating power of life with depression. And I'm so glad to see more and more people come forward and talk about this, because in the work we do at Face It, working with men who struggle with depression, I hear this all the time. I wasn't beaten. I wasn't, my parents were present. I have a job. Why do I still feel so terrible? And that's part of the shame that people are dealing with as well.
Now, his story continues because he says, I proudly say that I live with mental illness and that it's okay. I say with, because even though my mental illness tries its best, it doesn't control me, it doesn't define me, and I refuse to be stigmatized by it. And then he says that the nightmares for him started at age 7, and then anxiety at 13, right after that movie came out, the Stand By Me movie. And so he said, my panic attacks happen daily, not just when I was asleep. This is age 13. So when I tried to reach out to adults in my life for help, they didn't take me seriously. When I was on the set, I was having a hard time breathing because I was so anxious about making a mistake and getting fired. The directors and producers complained to my parents that I was difficult to work with. And when I was so uncomfortable with my haircut and didn't want to pose for teen magazine photos, the publicist told me I was being ungrateful and then trying to sabotage his own success. He said when he couldn't remember his lines because he was so anxious, that he couldn't even remember now. He said directors would accuse me of being unprofessional and unprepared, and that's when my anxiety turned into depression. He said not only did I have no idea what depression was, it wasn't until in my 20s, once I was pretty sure that I had it, I suffered with it for another 15 years because I was ashamed, embarrassed, and I was afraid. And you said this is part of your story too.
Absolutely, and that ashamed part, that fear part. I was a clinical social worker when I made a suicide attempt and ended up in the hospital. I knew full well what was wrong with me, but because of those fears, because I was afraid of being further rejected, because I was afraid of being abandoned, because I was afraid people would look at me and mock me and say, you're not a real man and you're not a real person, I couldn't tell anybody. The problem is all those things that Will describes there, eventually they just build up and they explode and they come out tragically in suicide. They come out in men abusing substances. They come out in men having affairs, men having addictions, gambling addictions, pornography addictions. Because of all that fear, that stigma, that shame of, if I acknowledge that I am not whole, who will care about me? And what we have to do, and what Will did here so nicely, is to say, here I am. In all my imperfections, I struggle with this, I feel inadequate, I have low self-esteem, I don't know where I belong, and yet I'm still a good person. And that's what I hear Will saying here, is despite all of these things that people might point their fingers at, he's come to realize he's a good man regardless of those things. And that's where your healing really can begin.
Right. Now, in the article, he also talks about, Mom, I know you're going to read this, because she reads his stuff online.
Right.
And he says, I don't want you to feel that you didn't do all that you could, because you did all that you could with what you knew.
Right.
I don't want somebody else's mom to not be able to help their son or daughter, but with what they might be seeing with their child.
Right. And what we know now, and I think about this too, I'm a little bit older than Will, I'm 51, but my parents, I showed all sorts of telltale signs when I was a kid. They didn't know any better. But now we know. Now we know that Will, when he was, having night terrors and probably crying and fearful, he wasn't being an obnoxious little brat. The poor kid was suffering from anxiety and depression. And so I think what parents, moms, dads, what we all need to do now is we need to be aware, particularly in kids, because what we know is these traumas, and that's what Will dealt with. This is trauma. A lot of people would say, oh, he was a movie star and he had everything going for him. He was terrified and petrified on a movie set. That's traumatic for him. And what we know is these traumas set themselves inside of us and shape us as we move forward. And if we don't learn how to put them in their proper place, we develop anxiety, we develop depression. So I think sometimes as parents, we need to take a step back and maybe ask a question beyond, well, is my kid just being needy or a brat, or is he not, not cooperating with me? And ask why. What's going on here?
So fast forward, so he's in his 20s and now 30s before he actually starts to do something about that. And you said that was part of your story too. So as guys now in their 20s and 30s, if they feel that they're going through some of the, what can they do? How does your organization help them?
The first thing we tell them is tell someone. Find a trusted friend. We know how much shame people carry around with them when it comes to feeling like this, as though I don't belong. And you have to push back against this belief that if I tell someone, I will be shunned. We all have trusted people in our lives. Most of us do. We have somebody, we have a friend. And if you reach out to that person, or if you reach out to us at Face It, even in an email, I don't care if you're 10,000 miles from us, and say, I must be the only one going through this, and suddenly you'll realize you're not, then healing can begin, because now you're no longer alone. That's how Will felt. That's how so many men feel. They feel alone. They feel that nobody can possibly understand. Nobody can possibly feel as horrible as I do. And then wait, other people feel this way? Then we can start working to get better, and we can connect you to people. We can help you understand your, the treatments, whether it's medication, whether it's therapy, whether it's yoga, meditation, whatever it might be. Then you can start tackling this thing head on.
When guys show up then for their meetings with the Face It Foundation, I don't know if they do any of it online, but when they show up in person, what are some of the steps that you take them through? Do you have a multiple addressing situation or the guidelines?
Sure. So what we do is, if a guy shows up for the very first time, and our groups are, they're formed groups, and so there's about 12 men who attend these groups regularly. The very first thing we do is to have everybody go around and tell something about themselves, and you'll see that guy who's new to the group going, oh, he gets it, and he gets it, and he gets it, and he... So now, like I said before, now he realizes he's not alone. And so what we do, because we use peer support, we use friendship as a means to support people, we encourage that interaction to share their stories, because especially for men, that notion that all of these challenging and difficult and quite frankly thoughts that don't make any sense about, as Will said, I've got everything going for me and yet I still don't like who I am or feel good about himself. By sharing those thoughts with one another, they all start to get, they identify with one another and they connect with one another.
I thought it was interesting on your website, you have two guys that went off to Wisconsin to address depression in men, and it was a group of construction workers. It was their boss that wanted this topic addressed. And I thought that was really interesting, because that's kind of like, that's the manly men, they got the work hats on and the belts, and that might be a very hard thing for guys in the construction business to admit to, right?
And how that all came about is, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the number one rate of suicides per 100,000, 53 per 100,000, is in the trades. It's the construction workers. It's the trades. It's the electrical workers and the plumbers. And there's this terribly high rate of suicide. And in connecting with that construction group, what you learn is these guys are isolated. It's an extremely macho culture. And coming forward to admit that you struggle, whether that's crying, whether that's feeling inadequate, whether that's not liking yourself, or feeling suicidal, it's incredibly difficult to come forward. But what the construction industry has already learned is that if they push and facilitate these conversations within the workplace, suddenly a guy will come forward if somebody else will have said, yeah, I dealt with that. Mm-hmm. And that's why we need more of the Will Wheatons and the regular Joe guys coming forward to say, I had this and I talked about it and now I feel better. Mm-hmm.
How much does then alcohol abuse play a role in the depression side of guys?
Huge. Mm-hmm. A lot of men use alcohol to self-medicate. It's the classic, for so many men, when a feeling comes in that we don't like, we don't know how to sit with it. We need it to go away. We need to push it away. And when you're depressed and anxious, pushing that feeling away is really, really difficult. Mm-hmm. And so if I use alcohol, then I can make that feeling go away. Mm-hmm. And so there's high rates of substance abuse in men with depression. And the presence of alcohol and the presence of drugs absolutely increases the risk of suicide. Mm-hmm. Because now your judgment is impaired, your impulsivity is even less, or even greater, mm-hmm, and that risk goes through the roof. And so we see it all the time. It's, you think about the construction industry. We were having this mm-hmm. conversation at this particular meeting. And, it's one thing when the guys all want to go out for a beer on Friday. It's another thing when the guys always want to go out for a beer on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Mm-hmm. You're using it to hide. You're using it to hope you can make the pain go away. And all it does is make you feel worse. Mm-hmm.
Does this also then reflect upon the fact that guys have a hard time going to a doctor and saying, I have these feelings, and because medicating it with alcohol is a far easier thing to do than going maybe to a doctor and saying, is there something over the counter that I can or help? And so does the pharmaceutical industry, does that help then with the depression portion of it?
And to tackle the first part of that question, men don't go to the doctor in general for medical conditions. And so expecting a man to go to a doctor, when they don't even know what's going on with them, it's a very difficult thing. So we have to help them with that. And Will even talks about it in his article. He took a low dose of an antidepressant and it helped him dramatically. And so antidepressants may absolutely be part of the treatment equation. And that's where it becomes really important to talk to a medical professional, whether it's your physician, a nurse practitioner, a psychiatrist, whoever that might be, to say, gosh, could this help with some of my feelings? And help make me, calm me down, particularly from the anxiety standpoint, mm-hmm. To begin to deal with some of these things. Mm-hmm.
So when a guy walks in your door, what are some of the avenues that they have come through in order to make it to the Face It Foundation?
We get a lot of men who have been acutely hospitalized following suicide attempts. Okay. And so our mental health system has, we have an inpatient approach, which is by and large keeping people safe, people who have made a suicide attempt. And then once, you've been stabilized from that, we put you out into the outpatient world and encourage you to see a therapist, a counselor, that sort of thing, and, mm-hmm. see your prescribing medical professional for medication. Mm-hmm. And so for us at Face It, we have seen a lot of guys who have tried various systems and didn't find a lot of success. Mm. They didn't like therapy. They didn't like the side effects. The medication didn't help them to the degree they were hoping. And so at Face It, we get a lot of guys who have been in the mental health system and still not quite finding that place of contentment and peace they're looking for. Mm-hmm. And through peer support and friendship, sometimes we can absolutely help with that component.
Is there also a spiritual aspect of that as well? And the reason why I ask is I know that Bill, and when you founded it, it was because he heard you speaking at a church.
Correct. And I believe personally, we don't advocate nor either way with regard to spirituality or religion. But anybody who comes into one of my groups is going to hear loud and clear that spirituality, for me, has been a huge part of my recovery. And we go to a lot of churches and give talks. And I think from that loneliness, isolation standpoint, I think a lot of what I've been able to learn through my own belief system and my spirituality is that when I can't be surrounded by loved ones, if I have some inner sense of peace and a higher power that I can turn to, gosh, that helps me not be so lonely and feel so isolated.
If somebody is watching this and they sense that that's what their partner is going through, a wife or somebody that is in a relationship, how do they best broach this subject with them to come find you?
I think slow and steady is always a good way. I think so many men don't even see how they're behaving. They don't see the way their agitation, their withdrawing, their anger towards their partners or their children or their friends or what have you. And so I think a partner can always broach this by saying, I'm really concerned about you. And I know that you are feeling, or I sense that you're feeling, like you're struggling and things aren't well. Could we look at this website together? Could we maybe email this organization and see if they'd talk to you? Because we'll talk, we're based here in Minneapolis, obviously, but I've talked to people literally all over the world.
That's right, yeah.
Just to have conversations, to get people walking down a path of, maybe it's depression, maybe it's anxiety.
Because I know when you did your bike ride, and that now is a few years ago.
Yes, gosh, yes.
You went from San Francisco all the way to the East Coast.
Yes.
Yeah, and just to raise awareness.
Right.
And you were met with organizations all along the way that were 100% behind you because they saw that men needed help with addressing their depression and especially their thoughts of suicide.
Right, and it's just, that bike ride was 2011, if you can believe that, 7 years ago already. And more people are recognizing the suicide data alone continues to climb in men. And even, as we begin to expand the manner in which we look at depression in men, we understand now more than ever that we have to look at anger. We have to look at substance abuse issues. We have to really look at these reckless behaviors that men are engaging in, because those are real easy to dismiss as guy behaviors. Well, underneath that is a whole lot of sadness and a whole lot of lack of self-esteem and a whole lot of pain that we need to address beyond just saying knock it off, get over it, act like a decent man. And so everywhere, I think more and more we're acknowledging that this is a real issue in men.
Okay, so how do people find you?
They can go to our website, www.faceitfoundation.org. If anybody ever wanted to email me directly, they could just info@faceitfoundation.org. And I can assure them that I will respond to them, I will get back to them, and we will absolutely at least help them figure out what's the next step they can take.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. This is such an important topic.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.